Everyone in the roadside diner froze when a biker laughed and smashed a bottle over a woman's head. He thought he had humiliated her in front of everyone, but within seconds it became clear he had made a fatal mistake, because standing before him was Ronda Rousey, the legend of mixed martial arts. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The night along the Texas highway carried with it a heavy stillness that only long stretches of open road could hold. Neon light buzzed from a flickering sign nailed to the side of a squat roadside diner, its letters spelling out Rosie's in uneven strokes of faded red. The air outside was dry and cool, filled with the smell of hot asphalt and the faint tang of gasoline drifting from the truck stop down the road. Every now and then a semi would thunder past, rattling the windows, and then the quiet would return, as if the world beyond the neon glow no longer existed. Inside the diner, the air was warmer, filled with the mingled aromas of strong coffee, fried bacon, and the faint sweetness of pies cooling on the counter. A jukebox in the corner murmured a country ballad from decades past, the twang of guitar strings weaving into the clatter of silverware and low conversations. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating cracked red leather booths, a checkerboard tile floor dulled by decades of boots and spilt drinks, and a long counter lined with heavy stools. Everything about the place suggested routine, a kind of steady rhythm built on years of late-night truckers, weary travelers, and locals looking for a cheap meal after long shifts. At one of the booths near the window sat a woman alone. Her hood was pulled up over her head, casting a shadow across her face, but her posture betrayed neither exhaustion nor vulnerability. Her shoulders were square, her back straight, her movements measured. She stirred her coffee slowly, her eyes focused on the dark liquid, but her awareness clearly stretching beyond it, taking in the room, the customers, the hum of the door every time it creaked open. This was Ronda Rousey, though no one in the diner seemed to recognize her beneath the ordinary clothes and quiet demeanor. She wore jeans, boots, and a faded hoodie that concealed the powerful frame beneath. To anyone glancing her way, she could have been any traveler stopping for caffeine before getting back on the road. Ronda was used to places like this. Roadside diners had a way of blurring together, their sameness a kind of comfort. They were anonymous, forgettable, the perfect places to sit in silence after the chaos of travel or the grind of training. Tonight she had left the gym hours earlier, her muscles still carrying the dull ache of punishment she inflicted on herself daily. She welcomed the ache. It reminded her she was alive. It reminded her she was sharpening her edge. Still, there were moments she sought something beyond the mats and cages, moments where she wanted quiet and solitude, and the diner provided just that. She took another sip of coffee, feeling the bitter warmth spread down her throat. Across the room, two long-haul truckers sat at the counter hunched over plates of steak and eggs, their broad shoulders slumping with fatigue. A pair of young men, probably college students, played with the remains of a late-night breakfast, their laughter a little too loud as they argued over football. Behind the counter, Rosie, the owner of the diner, wiped down glasses with the rhythm of someone who had done it 1,000 times, her eyes sweeping over the room with the sharpness of a woman who had seen her share of late-night dramas and wanted no trouble under her roof. Her hair was pulled back in a bun streaked with gray, and her forearms, strong from years of labor, flexed with casual authority. Ronda liked Rosie. She didn't know her beyond ordering pie and coffee, but she respected the way the woman moved around her own place like a seasoned sheriff keeping order. Rosie's gaze had fallen on Ronda a couple of times that evening, the way it did on every lone traveler. Not suspiciously, but with the quiet calculation of someone who wanted to know who was in her house and whether they would cause trouble. Ronda had returned the glance with a small nod. That was enough. For a while, nothing happened. The jukebox cycled through another song, one of the truckers let out a long sigh, and Rosie's coffee pot hissed as she refilled it. Ronda finished her pie, leaving only crumbs on the plate. Outside, headlights swept past the diner, and then silence returned again. It was the kind of evening that could have passed entirely unremarked, the kind of stop a traveler would forget the moment they pulled away from the neon sign and back onto the highway. But there was an undercurrent, subtle at first, a tension like the faint hum of a string waiting to snap. Rhonda felt it, though she didn't shift in her seat. Years of fighting, of being in arenas where violence was a heartbeat away, had sharpened her senses. She could tell when the balance of a room was about to shift, when peace was nothing more than the calm before a storm. She looked at the door for no reason she could explain, just as the bell above it jingled and the night air poured in. She lowered her coffee cup and let her gaze fall back to the dark liquid. For now there was no reason to move, no reason to change her posture. But in the stillness of her mind she prepared. She had seen it enough times before, the wrong kind of voices, the wrong kind of swagger. Trouble rarely announced itself politely. It barged in, loud and overconfident, convinced it owned the space, and trouble was about to step across the threshold of Rosie's diner. Rhonda's fingers tightened around her coffee mug. She remained outwardly calm, her expression unreadable, but her instincts whispered the truth. The peace of the diner was about to be shattered, and when it was, she knew she wouldn't sit quietly in her booth for long. The hum of the jukebox had just faded into silence when the diner door burst open, the sudden slam of wood and the jangle of the bell making several heads turn at once. Cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the stench of gasoline, cheap beer, and sweat. A rough laughter spilled through the doorway before the men themselves even appeared, and then they came in, a cluster of heavy boots, leather vests, and loud voices that seemed to claim the space before they had even crossed the threshold. The room changed in an instant. Where there had been the lazy murmur of a late-night crowd, there was now a tautness in the air, as though the temperature itself had shifted. 8 men, maybe more, filled the entryway, each of them carrying the kind of swagger that didn't come from confidence, but from years of taking advantage of fear. They spread out as they entered, their boots clattering against the tile floor, spurs and buckles jingling. The leader of the group stood out immediately, a broad-shouldered man with a thick beard streaked with gray and a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. His eyes were cold, his grin wide and unkind. He paused at the door, sweeping his gaze across the diner as though measuring the worth of each person inside. When his eyes lingered briefly on Rhonda's booth by the window, he smirked and nudged the man closest to him. Rosie stiffened behind the counter. She didn't say a word, but her hands slowed in their rhythm of wiping glasses. She had seen these men before, or men just like them, and she knew the signs. Their entrance was not casual. It was a storm front pushing into calm skies. The truckers at the counter hunched a little lower over their meals, suddenly finding their plates very interesting. The young men in the booth stopped laughing and exchanged uneasy glances. The entire room seemed to shrink inward, as though everyone instinctively wanted to be smaller, quieter, less noticeable. The bikers didn't sit right away. They prowled first, taking up space with their movements, their laughter too loud, their jokes sharp and mocking. One of them banged his palm against the jukebox until it sputtered back to life, switching songs mid-note into something faster, harsher. Another leaned over a college student's table and plucked a fry from his plate, popping it into his mouth and grinning when the student said nothing. Fear was a game to them, and this was the opening round. Finally, the leader claimed a table in the center of the room, dropping heavily into the seat with his legs stretched out and his boots muddying the linoleum. The others gathered around him, their voices carrying over one another as they shouted orders for beer and shots. Rosie approached with a stiff smile, her voice steady though her eyes flashed. "Kitchen's closed," she said flatly, "but coffee and drinks I can do." They jeered, but they didn't push her further. Not yet. She poured their beers with a mechanical precision, placing each glass on their table with a firm clink. Rhonda hadn't moved. She sat with her hood still half drawn over her face, her coffee in hand, her eyes lowered but watchful. She had seen this dance before in 100 places that looked just like this diner. Men swaggering into a space like they owned it, feeding off the intimidation they created, testing the room to see who would stand up and who would crumble. Her training told her that when you dealt with predators, the safest course was often to remain unnoticed until you couldn't be ignored. She didn't tense, didn't show a flicker of expression, but inside her instincts coiled tight, knowing that she was already marked. It didn't take long. One of the younger bikers, his face half hidden under a bandana, was the first to notice her properly. He elbowed his companion and jerked his chin toward her booth. "Look at that," he said loudly, his voice pitched so the whole room could hear. "Little lady all by herself. Wonder who she's waiting for." His friend chuckled and replied, "Maybe she's waiting for us." The table erupted in laughter, the kind that grated on nerves, intentionally cruel and invasive. The leader turned in his seat, following their line of sight. His gaze landed on Ronda, and something flickered in his expression: interest, amusement, perhaps even a spark of malice. He studied her for a moment longer than necessary, then leaned back with a grin that showed uneven teeth. "Well now," he drawled, his voice cutting through the noise of the diner. "What do we have here?" Several of the bikers turned in their seats to look at her more openly. Some smirked, some licked their lips in exaggerated gestures. Others just laughed as if the idea of a woman daring to sit alone in their presence was the funniest thing in the world. Rhonda raised her eyes briefly from her coffee, her gaze level, unflinching, then lowered them again. It was enough to quiet them for a second, just long enough to remind them that she was not exactly what they assumed. The pause only fed the leader's interest. He slapped his palm on the table, making the glasses rattle. "Boys," he said, his grin widening, "I think tonight just got more interesting." Rosie's jaw tightened. She knew where this was heading, and she knew she had little power to stop it. Calling the sheriff was an option, but in the time it would take for anyone to arrive, the damage would already be done. She glanced at Rhonda, saw the calm in her face, and frowned. There was something about that calm that unsettled her. It was the calm of someone who wasn't afraid. The rest of the diner seemed to shrink even further. Conversations had ceased entirely. The only sounds now the laughter of the bikers and the faint clatter of the jukebox. The two truckers at the counter exchanged a quick look, but neither moved. The college students stared down at their plates. No one wanted to draw attention. The leader rose from his seat with deliberate slowness, the scrape of his chair loud in the silence. He adjusted the chain around his neck, tugged his leather vest straight, and started toward Rhonda's booth. His boots struck the floor with the rhythm of a man who expected people to move aside when he passed. And they did. He loomed closer, his grin still fixed in place, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. Rhonda didn't flinch. She took another sip of coffee, placed the cup gently back on the saucer, and waited. The air in the diner thickened with anticipation, the quiet before a strike. Everyone's eyes were on the corner booth now, even Rosie's, though she tried to mask it by busying her hands at the counter. The leader stopped just short of her table, the shadow of his frame falling across her. "Well, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying easily to every ear in the room. "Mind if I join you?" The laughter of his men echoed from the center table, harsh and ugly. Rhonda lifted her gaze slowly, her eyes locking on his without hesitation. She didn't answer right away, and the pause stretched until it became uncomfortable. For the first time that night, the leader's grin faltered just slightly, though he covered it quickly with a snort of amusement. The tension was thick enough to taste. Rosie set down her glass and clenched her rag, whispering under her breath, "Lord help us." The leader leaned closer, resting one hand on the edge of the table. His voice dropped low, but not so low that the others couldn't hear. "Don't be shy. We're just having a little fun." His words dripped with mockery, a bait laid carefully, daring her to respond. Rhonda's lips parted slightly as if to speak, but she closed them again, tilting her head just enough to study him without expression. It was a small motion, but in that moment it carried weight, a silent refusal to be drawn in on his terms. The leader straightened, his grin returning, louder now, masking the irritation building beneath. The laughter of his men swelled again, their jeers cutting across the diner. And as the sound filled the air, Rhonda lifted her cup once more, the calm in her movements unshaken, though her eyes never left his. The storm had arrived, and the diner knew it. What no one yet realized was that the balance of power in the room was already shifting, not in the direction the bikers believed, but toward the quiet figure by the window who had not yet begun to move. The laughter that rolled from the bikers' table carried across the diner like broken glass, jagged and sharp, daring anyone to object. Rosie wiped the same glass over and over again at the counter, her eyes narrowing at the scene unfolding near the window booth. She had seen men like this before, loud and brash, thriving on fear like it was fuel. What unsettled her wasn't their behavior. She had handled plenty of rowdy nights, but the stillness of the woman in the booth. That stillness was not weakness. It was something else, something she could not yet name. The leader stood with one hand braced on the edge of Ronda's table, his grin broad and self-assured. His men were eating it up, their hoots and jeers bouncing off the walls as if this were a stage, and he the star performer. Ronda raised her eyes to him again, calm and steady. That calm infuriated him more than an insult would have. He expected flinching, maybe anger, maybe fear. Instead, he found the cool gaze of someone entirely unimpressed. "Well now," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. "You got a name, sweetheart? Or you just like sitting here keeping us all guessing?" He leaned in closer, his breath sour with whiskey. Ronda spoke for the first time, her voice even, quiet enough that people had to lean in to hear, but clear as a bell. "I'm just drinking my coffee." She didn't blink, didn't let her eyes waver. Her answer sent a ripple through the diner. Simple as it wasn't submission, and it wasn't fear. It was dismissal. The leader froze for half a beat, his smile twitching. Then he barked a laugh loud enough to make the younger men at his table slam their hands against the wood in approval. "Just drinking your coffee," he repeated mockingly. "Ain't that cute? Boys, she just wants her coffee." One of the bikers shouted from the table, "Maybe she wants some company while she drinks it." More laughter followed, harsh and ugly. The leader straightened, his shadow long against the booth's tabletop. "See, thing is, darling, nobody drinks alone when we're around. It's rude. Makes us feel like you think you're too good for us." "You think you're too good for us?" His voice dropped, heavy with the weight of menace disguised as humor. Ronda tilted her head slightly, studying him, her lips pressed into a faint line. "I think you're in my light," she said calmly, shifting her eyes to the window as if to remind him he was blocking her view of the neon outside. It was such a small response, but it landed like a slap. The men at the table laughed louder, sensing the edge of humiliation on their leader's face, but also unsure which way the moment would tilt. The leader's grin faltered again, and the scar across his cheek seemed to deepen as his jaw tightened. He slammed his palm down on the table beside her coffee cup, the sound echoing through the room. "You got a smart mouth on you," he growled. Then in a sudden flash of cruelty, he grabbed the neck of his beer bottle, half drained and sweating with condensation, and raised it high enough for everyone to see. The moment stretched thin, everyone in the diner frozen in their seats. Rosie's heart leapt into her throat, but her voice caught before she could shout. The truckers at the counter stiffened, their forks hovering midair. The college students leaned back as though distance could protect them from what was about to happen. The leader's grin returned, wider now, desperate to reassert control, to remind everyone he was the man in charge. "Here's to the lady and her coffee," he sneered. Then, with a swift motion, he brought the bottle down hard against Ronda's head. The sound cracked like a gunshot, glass exploding, beer spraying across the table, the shards glinting in the harsh fluorescent light. Gasps filled the room, one sharp cry breaking from Rosie's lips before she clamped her mouth shut. The leader staggered back half a step, triumphant, expecting laughter to roll in behind him, expecting the woman to slump, dazed, or collapse entirely. But Ronda did not move. Beer dripped down her hair, slid along the curve of her cheek, and pooled on her hoodie. She sat exactly as she had before, her back straight, her shoulders square, her gaze fixed on the man who had struck her. Not a flinch, not a blink, not even the twitch of surprise crossed her face. Her eyes, sharp and unwavering, locked on his, and for the first time that night, silence consumed the diner completely. The laughter that should have followed never came. Instead, the bikers exchanged uneasy looks, their smirks faltering. The leader froze in place, his grin brittle, his breathing suddenly louder in the quiet. He had expected a performance. He had delivered violence as entertainment, something to prove his dominance. But the lack of reaction turned the spectacle into something entirely different. Rosie dropped the glass she had been holding, the shatter against the floor startling in the oppressive quiet. She stared at the woman in the booth, at the steady composure on her face. She had seen fights before, seen men crack bottles over each other's heads in drunken brawls, but she had never seen someone absorb the act as if it hadn't even happened. Her fingers trembled as she bent to gather the shards, whispering under her breath, "Dear Lord." The leader tried to laugh, the sound hollow. "Tough one, ain't you?" he said, his tone brittle, the weight of unease creeping into his voice. He looked to his men, expecting their laughter to bolster his own, but their eyes were darting between him and Ronda with uncertainty. Something in the air had shifted, something he couldn't quite grasp. Ronda lifted her hands slowly, her movements deliberate, and brushed a trail of beer from her forehead with 2 fingers. She looked at the wetness on her skin, then back at the leader, calm and unwavering. The simple gesture, casual and unhurried, spoke louder than words. It wasn't defiance, it was indifference. The silence thickened until it felt suffocating. The jukebox clicked and sputtered as the record ended, leaving the room void of sound. The tension coiled tight, every person in the diner holding their breath. The leader cleared his throat, trying to salvage the performance. "Just a joke," he said loudly, forcing the grin back onto his face. "Just playing around." But his voice betrayed him. The edge of nervousness cut through, and everyone heard it. Rhonda's eyes did not leave his. She didn't speak, but her stillness screamed louder than any retort. One of the bikers muttered under his breath, uneasy, "Boss?" But the leader snapped his head toward him, silencing him with a glare. Still, the doubt was there now, seeping through the cracks. At the counter, one of the truckers leaned toward the other and whispered, "That fool just signed his own death warrant." His words, though quiet, carried in the silence, and the leader heard them. His grin wavered again. Ronda slowly pushed her coffee cup aside, clearing the space in front of her. The scrape of ceramic on the table seemed louder than thunder. She rose from her seat, water and beer dripping from her hoodie, her frame unfolding to its full height. She wasn't taller than the man before her, but she seemed larger somehow, her presence expanding, filling the space between them with quiet inevitability. The leader stepped back instinctively, just half a step, but enough for everyone to notice. His boots squeaked on the tile, and in that small sound was the first admission that the power in the room no longer belonged to him. Ronda spoke, her voice calm, steady, each word deliberate. "Are you finished?" Weizana, the question sliced through the silence, not loud but sharp as steel. The leader opened his mouth, but no words came. His men shifted in their seats, the earlier bravado draining away, replaced by the dawning realization that they were not the predators tonight. The spark had been struck. The air burned with anticipation, the weight of violence not yet unleashed but already promised. And in that moment, as every eye in the diner watched, it became clear that nothing in Rosie's diner would remain the same after what came next. The room hung in that unnatural silence, the kind that felt like a held breath, stretched tight and waiting to snap. Beer dripped steadily from Rhonda's hoodie, pattering onto the floor in small dark splashes, the only sound in the diner besides a faint buzz of the overhead lights. The leader of the bikers shifted uneasily in front of her, his once broad grin hollow now, his eyes darting to the corners of the room, as if searching for something to anchor him. He had expected cheers, maybe roars of approval, a storm of laughter at his display of cruelty. Instead, he found a sea of wide eyes, some fearful, some fascinated, all fixed not on him, but on the woman he had struck. Ronda stood quietly, the lines of her face unreadable, her gaze sharp and unwavering. The way she moved, or rather the way she didn't, was more threatening than if she had raised a fist. Stillness in that moment carried the weight of something inevitable. The leader forced himself to recover, straightening his shoulders, puffing out his chest, trying to reassert the swagger that had always carried him through these situations. His men watched him, their smirks faltering, waiting for a cue. "Well," he said, his voice strained but loud, "looks like the lady's tougher than she looks. Ain't that right, boys?" A few uneasy chuckles rose from the table where the bikers sat, but they died quickly, swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The men exchanged glances with each other, their confidence shaken. One scratched his beard and muttered something under his breath. Another toyed with his glass, as though the liquid inside might offer him courage. Rosie, behind the counter, set down her rag and took a careful step back. Her eyes darted between the two figures locked in their silent confrontation. She had been in this business long enough to read the air, to sense when a bar fight was about to break out. But this wasn't like any fight she'd seen before. She had witnessed bottles cracked over skulls, chairs splintered across backs, fists flying in a storm of drunken rage. This was different. This wasn't rage. This was precision waiting to be unleashed. The leader leaned down slightly, trying to loom over Ronda, his voice dropping to something lower, meant only for her. "You think you can stare me down, sweetheart? You think you can sit there calm as a stone after I just smashed a bottle over your head?" Ronda didn't answer. Instead, she glanced briefly at Rosie, her expression softening for just a fraction of a second. Then she turned her eyes back to the man before her and spoke in a tone so measured, so even, it cut sharper than any shouted threat. "You're in my way." The words seemed to strike harder than the broken glass had. The leader's face flushed, his jaw clenching, his hands balling into fists at his sides. Behind him, one of his men tried to diffuse the tension with a laugh, but it rang false, brittle, and quickly fell away. The leader's pride bristled, his ego unable to withstand the sting of dismissal. He had built his reputation on intimidation, on making others fold beneath his gaze. Now, confronted with a woman who absorbed his worst and answered with calm indifference, he felt the ground shifting beneath him. He couldn't allow it. He wouldn't. He slammed both palms on the edge of her table, making the cups rattle, trying to shake her composure. "Lady, I don't think you know who you're dealing with." From the counter, one of the truckers muttered just loud enough for his companion to hear, though the sound carried anyway in the silent room. "No," he said, his voice low but certain. "It's him that doesn't know." The leader spun his head toward the voice, glaring, but the trucker had already returned his attention to his plate, calmly cutting into his steak as though the drama unfolding nearby had nothing to do with him. That small act of indifference only heightened the tension. The leader turned back to Ronda, his cheeks red with anger, his grin now gone completely. Ronda pushed the coffee cup further away with one finger, the scrape echoing against the silence. She straightened to her full height, and though she was not taller than the man before her, she seemed to rise above him in presence alone. Her voice was steady, calm as she said, "I don't think you want to finish what you started." For a moment, no one moved. Then the leader, driven more by desperation than bravado now, barked a laugh, a hollow echo of his earlier confidence. "Hear that, boys? She thinks she can tell me when to stop." He turned toward his men, seeking the support he had always counted on. But their eyes betrayed them. They weren't laughing now. Some avoided his gaze entirely. Others shifted uneasily in their seats. Doubt had crept into them, subtle but corrosive, gnawing at the unity they had walked in with. The leader turned back, his pride wounded, his anger rising. He grabbed the edge of her table again, his knuckles white, and leaned in so close that the sour stench of alcohol poured from his breath. "You don't get to tell me nothing," he snarled. Ronda's eyes flicked briefly toward Rosie again, then back to him. "I'm not telling you," she said simply. "I'm warning you." The words, delivered in that same even tone, cut deeper than a scream ever could. The leader opened his mouth, ready to lash out, but the weight of the room pressed down on him. He could feel it in the air, the way the crowd was no longer with him, the way eyes lingered on Ronda rather than himself. For the first time that night, he felt the shift of power slip from his grasp. He tried to reclaim it, lurching upright and raising his voice. "You don't scare me," he bellowed, his words shaking with more desperation than authority. "Nobody in this room scares me." He turned to his men again, shouting, "Right, boys?" But his voice cracked at the end, betraying him. His men shifted uncomfortably. One muttered, "Yeah," but it lacked conviction. Another picked at his nails rather than meet his leader's eye. The silence that followed was damning. Rosie stepped out from behind the counter then, her voice cutting through the tension with practiced authority. "That's enough," she said, her tone sharp and firm. She walked closer, though her eyes stayed fixed on Ronda, not on the biker. We're not having this in my place. Rhonda gave her a faint nod, a flicker of reassurance, before turning her full attention back to the man who still loomed in front of her. He was seething, his pride wounded, but his bravado unraveling under the weight of the moment. You should listen to her, Rhonda said, her voice low, steady and final. Walk away while you can. The leader's eyes darted, wild with anger, but his body betrayed him as he took a step back without realizing it. The squeak of his boot on the tile was a confession, and everyone heard it. His men shifted again, and this time their eyes weren't on him. They were on her, and in that instant, as the balance shifted irreversibly, the mistake was made. The bikers had come into Rosie's diner believing they owned it, believing their noise and violence could control the room, but now with their leader faltering and the silent strength of the woman before them growing heavier by the second, they began to realize the truth. They weren't in control anymore. They weren't the hunters. They were the prey, and the storm they had invited into the diner was about to break. The silence in Rosie's diner had grown so taut that even the creak of a stool or the clink of glass seemed loud enough to shatter it. The bikers sat in a restless half-circle of unease, their laughter long since faded, replaced by a nervous shifting of feet and an unwillingness to meet one another's eyes. Their leader, red-faced and breathing hard, had stepped back without meaning to, betraying weakness in front of the woman he had tried to humiliate. That single step backward had tilted the balance of the room, and now the weight of every gaze pressed down on him, silently accusing, silently daring him to regain what he had just lost. Rhonda stood still, her presence carrying more weight than any posture of intimidation could. The amber glow of the neon sign outside flickered against the window and caught in the glisten of beer still dripping from her hairline. But her expression had not changed. She was calm, unflinching, her fists relaxed at her sides, as though she had no reason to fear the men who had swaggered in believing the night belonged to them. The irony was that it did still belong to them, just not in the way they had expected. The leader's pride clawed at him, forcing him forward again. He couldn't allow the moment to stand as it was, not in front of his men, not in front of strangers, and especially not in front of a woman who had refused to yield to his violence. His voice came out louder than before, brittle and breaking in places, like glass under too much strain. You think I'm walking away? He barked. After what I just did, after what you just said, nobody makes a fool out of me. There was no laughter behind him now, no cheers of agreement, only the shifting of boots on tile, the scrape of a chair leg, the nervous cough of one of his own men who had grown tired of the tension. The lack of support only drove the leader further, his chest swelling with the desperate need to reassert himself. He reached across the counter, grabbed a half-empty bottle of whiskey someone had abandoned, and smashed it against the edge of the table with a sharp crack. Shards fell to the floor, and he held the jagged neck in his fist, brandishing it toward Rhonda like a blade. You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are when you're bleeding. Rosie stepped forward then, her voice sharp. Put it down, she commanded, her tone carrying the authority of someone who had broken up fights twice this size. This is my place, and you don't... But Rhonda raised one hand gently, halting Rosie mid-sentence without even looking at her. Her eyes never left the man in front of her. She took a slow step forward, the hush in the diner deepening, and when she finally spoke, her words cut through the heavy air like the edge of a blade. You already tried breaking a bottle over my head, she said softly. Didn't work the way you thought it would, did it? The man's jaw twitched, his grip tightening around the glass shard until his knuckles turned white. His pride pushed him forward, but fear licked at the edges of his mind, a creeping doubt that gnawed at the bravado he had leaned on his entire life. He lunged. The room erupted. Rhonda moved faster than the eye could follow. She sidestepped his lunge, her hands snapping to his wrist with a precision born of endless hours on the mat. She twisted sharply, a clean judo movement, and the sound of bone and tendon straining carried across the silence before the leader even had time to cry out. The jagged bottle clattered to the floor. His knees buckled. And in the same fluid motion, she pivoted, using his own momentum against him, and slammed him down onto the tiles with a force that rattled the glasses on the counter. The breath rushed out of him in a broken grunt. Gasps rippled through the diner, and chairs scraped back as the other bikers shot to their feet. Rosie froze behind the counter, her eyes wide but her hands steady, ready to intervene if needed, though a small part of her knew there was nothing she could do to stop what had already begun. The leader rolled to his side, groaning, clutching his arm as if unsure whether it still belonged to him. His men exchanged looks, their hesitation obvious. They hadn't expected resistance, let alone this kind of measured surgical precision. But pride and loyalty, or perhaps just the inability to back down, forced them forward. "You're dead, lady," one snarled, grabbing a chair and swinging it in a wide arc. Ronda ducked beneath it, her body flowing low, and drove her shoulder into his midsection, lifting him clean off the ground. She spun, slammed him down flat on his back, and in the same motion pinned his arm with her knee. Before he could even catch his breath, she wrenched his wrist and locked him in a painful hold, forcing a guttural cry from his throat. The others surged forward then, chaos exploding across the diner like a dam breaking. One swung a fist, another grabbed a pool cue from the corner, and yet another leapt forward with a growl. But Ronda was already moving. She released the man beneath her and rolled to the side, rising in a fluid motion. The pool cue whistled past her ear, and she caught it with one hand, yanking it free from the man's grasp. In the same breath, she snapped it across her knee, tossing the broken halves to the floor like discarded kindling. The diner erupted into a storm of fists and shouts. The truckers near the counter scrambled back, dragging their stools with them. Rosie ducked low behind the bar, though her eyes remained locked on Ronda, unable to look away from the whirlwind that had descended on her diner. Ronda fought without hesitation, without wasted motion. Every strike was controlled, every movement deliberate. She wasn't brawling, she was dismantling. A jab here, an elbow there, a sudden sweep that sent a man's legs flying out from under him. The sounds of impact filled the air, the heavy thud of fists against flesh, the crash of bodies against tables, the grunt of men unprepared for the reality of facing someone who had lived her entire life training for moments just like this. One of the bikers, larger than the rest, lunged at her with arms wide, trying to wrap her in a bear hug. She let him close the distance, then twisted, hooking his leg with hers, and in a blur he was airborne, crashing into a booth so hard that the wood splintered beneath him. The entire diner shook, and the patrons who had not already fled pressed against the walls, eyes wide, too stunned to intervene, too enthralled to leave. The leader struggled back to his feet, his chest heaving, his pride bruised more than his body. He grabbed another bottle from a nearby table, brandishing it as he staggered toward her again. "You're finished!" he bellowed, his voice breaking. But Ronda was ready. She waited, calm, her body loose and balanced. When he swung, she slipped aside, catching his wrist mid-swing, and drove her fist into his ribs with brutal precision. The air whooshed out of him in a strangled gasp, and before he could collapse, she twisted his arm and locked it behind his back, forcing him down to his knees. The diner was chaos shouts, the scrape of boots, the groans of men writhing on the floor. But within it all, Ronda stood like the calm center of a storm. Every movement was practiced, every response immediate, and the bikers, for all their size and bluster, began to falter under the weight of a skill they couldn't match. One by one they fell. Some sprawled across broken chairs, others groaned on the floor clutching ribs or shoulders, their earlier arrogance stripped away. Only the leader remained pinned beneath Ronda's grip, his body trembling, his breath ragged. She leaned down close enough that only he could hear her words. "You should have listened when I told you to walk away." She released him then, letting him collapse onto the tiles, gasping and broken. The room was still except for the groans of the defeated, the faint hum of the jukebox that had long since gone silent. Rosie stood behind the counter, her eyes wide, her hands pressed flat against the polished wood. The truckers looked on with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The bikers who could still move dragged themselves upright, gathering their fallen leader, their bravado now nothing more than a memory. They stumbled toward the door, muttering curses under their breath, but none dared look Ronda in the eye as they passed. The neon glow from outside spilled across their broken forms as they disappeared into the night, leaving behind the wreckage of their mistake. The storm had broken, and in its wake, silence fell once more. Rhonda stood alone in the middle of the diner, breathing hard but steady, her hair damp with beer, her knuckles scraped but unbowed. She looked at Rosie then, and for the first time since the chaos began, allowed herself the smallest of smiles. Rosie exhaled, a sound halfway between a laugh and a sigh, and shook her head. "You're going to cost me more in repairs than those boys ever did in tips." Rhonda shrugged lightly, her calm returning as though the violence had never touched her. Better a broken table than a broken woman. And with that, the balance of the diner was restored, though everyone in that room knew it would never be quite the same again. They had witnessed not just a fight, but a reckoning, and it had left its mark on them all. The wreckage of the fight still lingered in the air of Rosie's diner long after the roar of violence had subsided. Chairs lay toppled, some cracked beyond repair, tables shoved at odd angles. One booth half collapsed under the weight of the large biker Rhonda had thrown with almost casual precision. Shards of glass glinted on the floor, reflecting the neon flicker from outside. Little reminders of the chaos that had torn through the place only moments before. The smell of spilled beer, sweat, and the acrid sting of whiskey broken across the tiles clung to the air like smoke after a fire. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence was heavier now, not tense with expectation as before, but stunned, almost reverent. The truckers who had been frozen at their stools finally began to breathe again, one rubbing a hand across his face as if trying to convince himself he had not imagined what he had just seen. The young couple at the back booth clung to each other, wide-eyed, their half-eaten plates forgotten. Rosie herself remained behind the counter, her hands braced against the wood as though it alone kept her steady, her sharp eyes locked on the woman at the center of the storm. Rhonda stood quietly, chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of someone who had pushed her body hard, but not beyond its limits. A thin trickle of blood ran down one temple where the bottle had broken against her skull, drying now into a crimson streak, but she paid it no attention. Her hoodie was damp, clinging to her shoulders, and her knuckles bore raw marks from where skin had met bone. Yet she stood as if none of it mattered, as if the storm had passed clean through her and left her unshaken. The bikers who could still walk had dragged their fallen leader out into the night, stumbling and muttering, their arrogance stripped bare. Through the windows, the glow of motorcycle headlights sputtered to life, engines coughing and then roaring as the defeated men mounted up. The sound echoed through the parking lot, angry and hollow, before fading into the distance. The night swallowed them, leaving behind only the wreckage of their mistake. Inside, the silence remained until Rosie finally pushed herself upright. She grabbed a rag, though for once it wasn't to polish glasses, and walked around the counter with a purposeful stride. "Let me see that," she said firmly, gesturing to the cut at Rhonda's temple. Rhonda shook her head slightly. "It's nothing. I've taken worse." "I don't care if you've taken worse," Rosie shot back. "You're bleeding in my diner, and I don't allow blood without tending to it." There was steel in her voice, but something softer beneath it too. An undertone of concern that had been absent when she'd barked orders at rowdy cowboys or drunken truckers in years past. Rhonda hesitated, then gave a small nod. She sat down at one of the intact tables while Rosie fetched a damp towel and a small tin of antiseptic she kept in the back for the occasional scrape. As Rosie dabbed gently at the wound, she muttered, "You know, you've got a head harder than most men's egos. That bottle should have dropped you cold." "It wasn't the first," Rhonda said quietly, her gaze drifting to the window where the motorcycles had vanished. "And it won't be the last." Rosie arched an eyebrow but didn't press further. She had learned long ago when to ask questions and when to leave silence to do its work. Around them, the patrons slowly began to move again. One of the truckers raised his glass in a small salute before draining the last swallow, while another muttered, "Damn, never seen anything like it," under his breath. The young couple whispered hurriedly to each other, their eyes darting toward Rhonda, as if she might leap across the room again at any moment. The calm returned gradually, though it was a changed kind of calm, one born of awe and a quiet respect. The fight had left marks on the diner's walls and furniture. but it had also left a deeper mark on those who had witnessed it. They would tell the story in their own ways, each shaping it, but none would forget the sight of a woman who had stood against a gang of men without fear, dismantled them one by one, and sent them limping into the night. Rosie stepped back, satisfied that the bleeding had stopped, and crossed her arms. You fight like a storm, girl, but storms don't pass without leaving damage behind. Ronda looked up at her, her eyes steady. Sometimes the damage was already here. All I did was clear it out. Rosie held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Maybe so? One of the truckers finally found his voice enough to speak up, calling across the room. Lady, I don't know who you are, but I'm buying you a drink. Hell, I'll buy you the whole bottle. Ronda allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Thanks, she said, but I'll just take water. The man laughed, shaking his head. Suit yourself, but if word gets out about tonight, you'll never pay for another drink in this town again. Rosie shot him a sharp look. And if word gets out, it'll bring them back twice as angry. Let's not invite more trouble than we already had. Her voice softened slightly as she added, though he's right about one thing. You've earned yourself more than respect tonight. Ronda sipped the fresh glass of water Rosie placed before her, letting the quiet words sink in. Respect. It wasn't something she chased, but it was something she valued, more than the roar of crowds or the bright lights of cameras that had once defined her career. Here in this small-town diner, among strangers who had seen her at both her most vulnerable and her most powerful, respect had been given freely, not demanded. As the night wound down, the remaining patrons finished their meals in subdued conversation, their eyes still flicking toward her now and then. The jukebox clicked back to life with an old country ballad, soft and steady, filling the space that had once been filled with violence. Rosie began setting chairs back upright, sweeping glass into piles, restoring her diner with the practiced resilience of someone who had seen messes before and knew they could always be cleaned. When the last of the patrons drifted out into the night, leaving only Rosie and Ronda behind, the weight of quiet returned. Rosie leaned against the counter, lighting a cigarette despite the small sign above her head that forbade it. She exhaled slowly, the smoke curling in the dim light. You didn't have to do it, Rosie said at last. Could have let them bark and swagger. Could have walked out. But you didn't. Ronda looked at her, her expression thoughtful. If you let men like that think they own the room, they'll never stop. They needed to learn they picked the wrong one this time. Rosie studied her for a long moment, then nodded. And you taught them. Taught all of us, maybe. She took another drag, the ember glowing red in the dark. But tell me something. What's a woman like you doing, wandering into a roadside diner like this? You don't strike me as someone passing through for no reason. Ronda hesitated. She wasn't one to share easily, but something in Rosie's tone, the blend of curiosity and earned wisdom, pushed her toward honesty. Sometimes I just need quiet, she admitted. A place where nobody expects me to be anything but another face. No cameras, no chance, no pressure to always win. Just a place to sit and breathe. Rosie nodded slowly, her eyes softening. You'll find a kind of peace here then, until the next storm blows in. Ronda smiled faintly. Storms always find me, one way or another. Rosie ground out her cigarette, her expression turning serious again. Then maybe it's not the storms finding you. Maybe you're the storm. The words lingered in the quiet room, heavy but true. Ronda didn't answer, but she didn't need to. She felt it in her bones, the truth of it. She was the storm, but not one of destruction without purpose. She was the storm that cleared the air, that stripped away arrogance and cruelty, that left behind something stronger in its wake. When she finally rose to leave, Rosie followed her to the door. The night outside was cool, the stars sharp against the wide Texas sky, the smell of asphalt and dust heavy in the air. The parking lot was empty now, save for Ronda's old car and Rosie's pickup. The silence was deep, broken only by the distant hum of the highway. Rosie placed a hand on her arm before she stepped out. You'll be remembered for this night, whether you want to be or not. Just know, not all battles need to be fought. Some storms you can let pass. Rhonda nodded once, her expression unreadable. Maybe, but some storms you don't get to choose. She stepped out into the night, the neon sign buzzing faintly above her, and paused for a moment at the edge of the lot. The air was cool against her damp hair, the sky vast and endless. For the first time that night, she let out a long breath, a release of tension that had coiled tight inside her since the first bottle had shattered against her head. The diner door closed softly behind her, Rosie's silhouette framed briefly in the glass before fading back into the light. Rhonda climbed into her car, started the engine, and let the headlights cut across the empty lot. As she pulled onto the highway, the dark ribbon of road stretching endlessly before her, she felt a quiet clarity settle in her chest. She had walked into a storm, stood unflinching in its center, and walked out again. Stronger, steadier, and reminded of something she had nearly forgotten in the noise of the world she came from. That true strength wasn't about applause or spectacle, but about the courage to stand firm when the world demanded you bend. The night swallowed her car, the hum of its engine fading into the distance. And back at the Lone Star Diner, Rosie began sweeping the last of the glass from the floor, humming softly to herself. The storm had passed, leaving behind a night no one who had witnessed it would ever forget. If you enjoyed this story, don't just stop here. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss what's coming next. Trust me, the next story is even wilder than this one. Choose your next adventure right now. Click on one of the videos on your screen and dive straight in. And don't keep this to yourself. Share this video with your friends. Let them feel the same shock and adrenaline you just did. Your support keeps these stories alive, so subscribe, watch, and share, because you won't believe what's coming next.